As all of you should know by now, I got into the Fire Emblem franchise by playing Fire Emblem Three Houses back when it released in 2019, sparking my never-ending fixation and love for the franchise and RPGs as a whole. So when the newest entry in the series was announced back in 2023, I jumped at the chance to purchase the new title, DLC and all, on the day it was released. At the time of purchasing Engage, my only experience with the Fire Emblem franchise was with Three Houses, so I was surprised when they reintroduced the weapon triangle and brought back the weapon and skill mechanics of the games before. It was a bit jarring at first, but I paid no mind to it, determined to enjoy the new entry of a franchise I had just grown an interest in. And through my experience playing Fire Emblem Engage, I truly learned what it meant to be a part of the Fire Emblem fandom and understand how this installment in the series shot itself in the foot by prioritizing its gameplay over substance. First thing I would like to touch upon is the story of this game compared to my first experience of Fire Emblem storytelling through Fire Emblem Three Houses. In Fire Emblem Three Houses, the story was clumsily made, but very enthralling and did wonders to expound on how a Fire Emblem game could tell a story. Engage essentially regressed everything that Fire Emblem Three Houses did to build upon storytelling in Fire Emblem, and became the peak of what the series is known for. Dragon Blood protagonist, gang of royal misfits and commoners alike, a friendship saves all anime story, lackluster antagonists who are evil just to be evil, and no noteworthy story beats. Now a good argument to make is, well, what do you expect of a game made purely to nostalgia bait its fan base by bringing back old characters and protagonists from previous installments? And well, yeah, you make a good point. But from the truly captivating story we got from the previous installment, could it really be unrealistic to expect some kind of elevated story from the next installment of the franchise? For me, it was definitely a letdown to see how lackluster and boring the story in Engage was, coming directly after such a narrative-rich and lore-driven game before it. But I guess the story was bound to fall flat when the entirety of the game was blatantly based off of its centerpiece of the Engage game mechanic. And with the announcement of Fortune's Weave, it becomes even more blatantly obvious how Engage was just straight up piggy slop to feed a starved Fire Emblem fanbase in between Fortune's Weave's development, in an attempt to maintain the hype for the franchise that Fire Emblem Three Houses brought, with the addition of a plethora of Three Houses rep and Engage serving to reinforce this blatant fact. However, I personally feel as though the focus on bringing back old characters hindered the development of the new ones they made for this installment, with very few characters in this game making me feel invested in them to the point of being passionate about them, opposed to Three Houses' notoriously enjoyable cast. I will say they had no trouble with their Gooner bait in this entry, however. Funny how that facet of the franchise never dipped in quality between installments. But moving on. Yes, the story was garbo, but Engage did do one thing right, and that was its gameplay. Fire Emblem Engage has some of the best and most polished game mechanics in the entire franchise, making for some of the most interesting and dynamic gameplay in the franchise's entirety. I somehow found a perfect balance where the Engage mechanic wasn't too overpowering or it made the game an easy slog to play through. If anything, without the DLC, it made training up characters and giving them specific class skills harder with the odd way they cultivated how a player is to obtain SP prior to SP books, the Well, and Veronica's personal skill. And while yes, there were obviously better rings than others, at least ring is fucking trash, you could still use any ring and have an enjoyable time playing around with unit synergy and who can utilize each ring best in your party. I also prefer the gameplay in this installment, opposed to Three Houses, which was a hilarious unbalanced game that can boil down to using one unit to carry you and takes nowhere near as much thinking and strategy as some Engage maps merit. Which leads me to my next observation. This game is not made for newbies to the franchise.
Well, duh,
says the smartass at the back of the room.
Could you not tell from the blatant nostalgia bait that you literally discussed earlier?
And yes, it is obvious. I want to talk about that fact a bit more in depth. In sacrificing the game's substance, this installment has actively alienated new players to the franchise by putting a bit too much focus on the gameplay. Fire Emblem is a nerdy franchise. Your average person isn't going to casually pick up the game. That's the hard truth of it. What draws most average RPG players into playing an RPG is the story. And the thing about Fire Emblem is that it has never really been about that. It has always been about its unique chess-like combat system, which to newer players is kind of uninteresting. So by focusing too much on that, the game has kind of shot itself in the foot in the aspect of broadening its demographic. To be honest, I'd even argue it can hinder the experience of someone who is more focused on the gameplay, simply because down to the core of any game, all players need to be hooked on a series is the why. It's what starts the obsession, what takes your average gamer and turns them into a Cheeto dust encrusted basement dweller. The first time you turn on a game, you learn why your protagonist fights for what they do. And then that springs your own need to progress further into the game to find out more, which eventually leads someone to the point where they begin to focus solely on gameplay, optimization, and calculation. It all starts from that single driving point of why. And with the substance of Engage being so little, it can actively hinder the enjoyment of the game simply because the why, that hook, is so lackluster. Who would play Pokemon without the goal of getting all 8 gym badges? Who would play Persona without the motive of changing the hearts of the decrepit? Who would play The Legend of Zelda without the driving force of the legend itself? Engage, and the Fire Emblem franchise as a whole, has yet to find that why, and it is because of that lack of substance that the community remains niche and struggles to break out beyond its intended audience. And the commercial performance of Engage compared to its predecessor shows how this hindered its ability to break beyond its nomenclature and become something that can be enjoyed by a wider audience, with Engage selling a measly 1.61 million copies compared to Fire Emblem Three Houses' 4.12 million. As much as people love to praise the importance of gameplay, and don't get me wrong, I wholeheartedly agree, a substantive story to drive the player into wanting to explore a title to its limits is just as important to making a game truly great. And by neglecting this aspect of its development, Fire Emblem Engage prevented itself from becoming something truly spectacular or noteworthy. I mean, what's the good of great gameplay if there is nothing making me want to come back and continue playing? If there's nothing to drive someone, there's no point for all those bells and whistles. And in the end, the core of a good RPG is its story and its ability to make you care about the world you are in. But those are just my thoughts as a somewhat new fan of the series. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for listening, and I hope you'll tune in to listen to whatever I have to talk about next. See you next time.